Good. Okay, so before we begin, we also did want to, we're just going to start, we'll share our screen here so that you can see the presentation. Okay, and before we begin, we just wanted to let all the audience know, just a trigger warning, some of the language that we will be reading directly from quotes or references of names of organizations are outdated and may be offensive to some audience members. So we'll give those who are uncomfortable with this just a moment to exit if you wish, but please know that this is a safe space. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Our presentation is Going Beyond Religion, the Activism and Community Service of Black Churches in Amherstburg and Colchester, 1826 to 1955. I'm Dr. Lorene Bridgen-Lennie. I'm the Assistant Curator here, and I'm joined by the Curator/Administrator, Mary-Katherine Whelan. Today is a really important day for the museum. It's our 48th anniversary, so we thought that we would give a presentation to celebrate that. We do also ask that any guests watching this presentation today, if you could please mute your microphone just to avoid any echo in the background. And also Mary-Katherine and I will be doing a Q&A following our presentation. So just type in any questions in the comment section, or you can raise your hand and we will call on you. So today we're going to be focusing on 4 churches in Amherstburg and Colchester. The first is the Nazarene African Methodist Episcopal Church. And for those who are unaware, that church is on the museum's property, and you can visit it Tuesday to Friday from 12 to 5 and Saturdays and Sundays 1 to 5. We're also going to be talking about the Amherstburg First Baptist Church, which is on the next street over from the museum, and the Nazarene Church on George Street. And then we'll be talking about Mount Beulah Church of God in Christ, which is just down the street from the museum, and then also the Central Grove African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is in Harrow, that's part of Colchester. So before we begin talking about the 4 churches that I just mentioned, we think that it's important to talk about first why these churches were so important and why Black churches were so important. Churches were often the first institution that Black settlers built for several reasons. Church was multi-purpose, not just a religious institution. Also, with a flood of freedom seekers entering Canada, including Amherstburg and Colchester, the church acted as a reception center and first spiritual home for many new arrivals. It was a terminus of the Underground Railroad, and it also assisted countless freedom seekers, providing them with food, shelter, and clothing. It was not safe for freedom seekers and free Black residents to travel back to the United States during the 1850s, especially after the Fugitive Slave Act, making it necessary to establish churches in this area. The Fugitive Slave Act allowed for the retrieval, for anyone who isn't aware of that act, it allowed for the retrieval of freedom seekers who escaped to free northern states in the United States and allowed for them to be forced back into enslavement. The church was also an educational institution, not only through Sabbath and Sunday schools and Bible classes, but also because churches could be the location of community schools. Churches were seen as the heart of the community where settlers could find job opportunities and land opportunities, and also host concerts, fundraisers, lectures, and other community events. The church was a place to organize and discuss concerns and issues, and the organizations created out of the church uplifted members, but also educated and trained members to be activists. These organizations also helped to challenge negative stereotypes, including that the community was uneducated, immoral, and could be a drain on society. The church itself was also a moral institution that helped with the community's image and also challenged negative stereotypes. It wasn't just organizations that was doing this, it was the church as well. And oftentimes, finally, Black settlers were not welcome in white churches, especially after 1850 when the number of freedom seekers increased. So that made it necessary for churches to be established. So now I'm going to pass it over to Mary-Katherine, who's going to talk about the Nazarene African Methodist Episcopal Church.
So I'm just going to talk briefly about the history of the church itself. The Nazarene African Methodist Episcopal Church was constructed in 1848 and descended from an early Methodist congregation established in 1826. The congregation was established by Reverend Noah C.W. Cannon, and along with a group of church trustees, purchased the land for the new church. The building was constructed by freedom seekers, those escaping enslavement, and refugees who arrived into Canada after the abolishment of slavery on August 1st of 1834. The church itself is architecturally distinctive, a remarkable vernacular fieldstone chapel made from stones hand-gathered from farmers' fields. Most notably, the Nasry was a terminus of the Underground Railroad, one of many all across this region in Canada. The church itself was named after Reverend Willis Nasry, who was a powerful community leader who led many congregations from the American-based Methodist Episcopal Church into a new Canadian-based British Methodist Episcopal Church congregation. After crossing the Detroit River, one of the narrowest points of entry, and upon arrival in Amherstburg, freedom seekers found that Nasry played a significant role in their newfound life, initially by offering itself as an interim resting place until permanent housing could be found, as a center of socialization where numerous everyday skills were taught. It also served as a school in its early years to educate those who denied this privilege. So on the screen here, we have a picture of Reverend Willis Nasry, and again, he was the bishop of the BME Church of Canada from 1856 to 1875. Between the years of 1888 through to 1960, the Nasry was in continual process of being restored and renovated thanks to contributions from the congregation. The congregation also contributed funds to many ministries that the AME Canadian Conference participated in, such as the Women's Missionary Society, Foreign Missionary Fund. In 1888, there was extensive renovations done to the Nasry, which cost $1,100 to complete, which is approximately $44,063.90 today, taking in with what inflation is. The roof was raised 6 feet, a pressed tin roof and oiled native lumber ceiling was installed. The exterior and interior walls were plastered, and new taller arched windows were installed, as well as new wainscoting, in addition to a 10 by 16-foot pulpit and choir loft. And so we have an image here of the Nasry much later, through the 1960s, but you can see this is what the church looked like after the renovations were made in 1888. The Nasry never had a huge congregation. At its peak, it had about 70 to 80 members. Despite its small congregation, they were a vital force within this rapidly growing organization. The Simpson family home, located 2 doors down from the church, is the home of Melvin Mac Simpson, the founder of the museum, and was also used as a church rectory. In fact, the pastor, Reverend T.H. Henderson, resided in this residence while he was pastor at the Nasry from 1931 to 1943. And you have some pictures here of the church as it is today. It has been restored. I will speak about that briefly, but these are pictures of what the church looks like today. In 1975, an annex built by the last 5 members of the Nasry's congregation was created to house the first iteration of the North American Black Historical Museum. Its continuous mission to preserve and promote the often overlooked and untold history of Black culture in Canada, and particularly in our region. The annex was dedicated the Reverend L.O. Jenkins Memorial Hall in honor of Reverend Lloyd Jenkins, the last pastor of the Nasry AME Church. With only a handful of congregation members left, the Nasry was forced to close its doors, and its last service was held in 1988. The permanent museum building opened on September 20th, 1981, and continues to preserve this historic site. So in these pictures here, the top shows the annex building after it was complete at the front of the church, and the picture below shows Reverend L.O. Jenkins and his family in front of the building, as well as the plaque that's memorializing it. The Nasry AME Church was a community hub where community members could gather and support one another, not only for religious services and Sunday school, but for community events, parties, fundraisers, concerts, and speaking engagements. There was interfaith mutual support between the Amherstburg First Baptist Church and the Nasry, as well as later on in the Central Grove, which we'll be talking about later on that church. Each respective church hosted fundraising events for one another in mutual aid, which became much more apparent after the end of the Civil War, when many freedom seekers returned back to the United States. So I'm going to talk about women's organizations in general and then talk about the ones that were involved in the church itself. So there were several groups spearheaded by Black women in the community to help foster growth and education of young people. They worked in their churches through ladies' auxiliaries, missionary societies, or other similar groups. And by the end of the 19th century, these activities expanded to include a greater mix of interdenominational and secular reform organizations. Black women were either not welcome or did not feel welcome in mainstream women organizations, and therefore they often created their own societies to work for the benefit of their communities and group members. Women who joined these organizations felt a responsibility to become involved in society. These organizations also led Black women to take more public roles beyond their domestic responsibilities, and they could be for charitable purposes or for the sole benefit of female members, in addition to many others that existed to aid the development of their community and women's rights. So example, for the purposes of educational opportunities, etiquette, and self-government. These organizations acted as a vehicle through which Black women could access public spaces beyond their domestic responsibilities. So a few examples of women's social organizations and group that existed in the church. I'm not going to go and read through all of them, but there was the Ladies' Aid, and they held social events like necktie socials, tea socials, ladies' fairs, concerts, and other entertainment to raise funds for the church, as well as celebrate large events like for example, on the 24th of April in 1896, the Queen Victoria's birthday. So just sort of showing that they want to be part of that general community and be accepted as such, but also, raising funds for their church in their community. We also have the Daughters of the Union, the Open Hand Society, and Young People Social Club, all again, working to raise funds for the museum or to engage in social activities within the church community, and also, invite people who are prominent in the community like Delos Rogers Davis, John H. Alexander, and Fred H.A. Davis, who were all upstanding members of the Black community in Amherstburg, and inviting them to be speakers or to be participants in their events that they're hosting. So I just want to talk about, the Nazarene being the foundation. Over decades, many leaders within the Black community emerged. So stonemason and carpenter Nelson McCurdy, he was a free refugee and he helped build the church. Descendants of the McCurdy family notably made a name for themselves in politics and activism. So George D. McCurdy, he was a politician and activist, and he served on the Amherstburg Town Council. He was a deputy reeve and sat on Essex Town Council as well. Alvin McCurdy was a carpenter and historian. He was a respected historian and collector of Black history documents. So this important collection is now preserved at the Archives of Ontario. Howard McCurdy, politician and activist, was the first tenured African-Canadian University faculty member in Canada. He was a civil rights activist and co-founder of the National Black Coalition of Canada, and was also the first African-Canadian member of Parliament for the NDP. George F. McCurdy, who was a politician and activist, was executive director of the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission and part of Canada's delegation to the UN on Canada's first report on the Covenant of Canada's human and civil rights. And finally, Melvin Mack Simpson, who's a museum founder. He was a respected community figure who cared deeply about the preservation and education of Black history. Now, fast forward. After years of giving to the community, the Nazarene Church needed help of its own. After the Nazarene became part of the museum complex, the building began to show its age and the structure was deemed unsafe. In the 1990s, the church was in desperate need of repairs and was facing destruction, but with the help of dedicated community members, museum staff, notably the curator at the time, Elise Harding Davis, fundraisers, charity events, in-kind services, and grants, enough money was raised to save the church and fully restore the property. All told, $2 to $3 million was raised to save the church. The restoration began in February of 1999, and the Nazarene was reopened September 23, 2000. It was designated a National Historic Site in 1999, and it was a full circle moment because the church had given so much to the community, and now it's time for the community to give back. Now I'm going to pass it on to Lorene, and she's going to talk about the Amherstburg First Baptist Church.
All right, so just a little bit of background information about the Baptist Church. It was founded in 1836. Members first met in the homes of members, with regular meetings later occurring at the home of John Liberty on George Street. And that property was next to the present church building. The Reverend Anthony Binga, who I'm going to talk about further, he was the first pastor. In 1845, it was decided to build a church, and all of the wood that was used to build the church was hauled from the bush and carved by hand. And this is what the church looks like today. Now, Mary-Katherine had mentioned Asa McCurdy earlier. This is a photograph of him from the Alvin D. McCurdy Fund from the Archives of Ontario. And the master carpenter that helped build the church was Deacon George Crawford, with first assistant being Asa McCurdy, who, as I said, was pictured here. And the church building was dedicated on December 25th, 1849, and the church activities included regularly performing baptisms in both summer and winter in the Detroit River opposite of Bois Blanc or Boblo Island until a pool was installed in the church in 1907. In those days, it was not unheard of to break a hole in the ice to perform baptisms. Large crowds came by ferry from Detroit, and many from Windsor came to the baptismal site to witness this event. And as early as 1851, there were at least 48 baptisms, which increased to 75 in 1867. Now, I mentioned Anthony Binga Sr. I'm going to talk a bit more about him because he's incredibly important to the church's history. He was born into slavery in Greene County, Kentucky, and in 1895, Wilbur H. Siebert, the author of The Underground Railroad from Slavery to Freedom, he interviewed Elder Binga, who explained, quote, "John Bucknell was my first owner, and when I was 6 years old, he sold my family to General Taylor, an uncle of Zachary Taylor, who was the 12th president of the United States. I never saw the day since I knew anything that I didn't want to be free." And he escaped in 1836, so his dream was realized. And this happened after Anthony's brother found a pocketbook with $500 inside of it that Anthony and some of his relatives, including his brother, made their way to Amherstburg with the assistance of Quakers and Underground Railroad operatives. The Binga family arrived 6 days after finding the pocketbook that changed their fate. It's a pretty amazing story. It was in Amherstburg that Anthony Binga Sr. was conductor of the Underground Railroad, with the First Baptist Church acting as a terminus of the Underground Railroad. So basically just an endpoint in the journey. Anthony Binga Sr. was a founding member and, as I mentioned, the first pastor of the Amherstburg First Baptist Church. And he was known as the walking preacher and the father of the Black Baptist because he traveled on foot to preach and raise money to build the church. And this picture here is a painting of the Reverend Binga, and it's painted by Patricia Neely McCurdy. And this painting is on display in the Amherstburg Freedom Museum's gallery. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about Anthony Binga Sr. And the picture that we have here is a smaller photo from, it's a large group photo. So we've had to zoom in on his face. So this is what he actually looked like. And it's from the minutes of ARBA, or the Amherstburg Regular Baptist Association, which I'm going to talk about later. So while traveling, Reverend Binga also helped communities create missions. Reverend Binga traveled to areas of settlement including Chatham, London, Woodstock, Niagara Falls, Hamilton, Oakville, and Toronto. The money that he raised helped to build the First Baptist Church. And Reverend Binga was pastor at Amherstburg First Baptist Church from 1836 to 1857 and also in 1865. He also preached in Hamilton, Mount Pleasant, Toronto, and North Buxton. And the 1891 minutes of the Amherstburg Regular Baptist Association described him as, quote, "our aged brother who always secures the attention of his hearers. His words, like arrows, whether polished or unpolished, are sure to hit the mark." So I'd mentioned the Amherstburg Regular Baptist Association. It's an incredibly important organization within the church, so I'm going to share more information about that. I'm going to refer to it as ARBA as well. ARBA is an organization made up of numerous Baptist churches throughout Ontario and Michigan, and it is the African Canadian community's longest running and farthest reaching organization. Amherstburg First Baptist is known as the mother church of ARBA, it all started there, which I'm going to explain. It was formed because Black residents were not welcome within white churches, and ARBA was established on October 8th, 1841, after the First Baptist Church, Amherstburg First Baptist Church, hosted a meeting which was called by the Second Baptist Church in Detroit, which wanted to unite the Black churches in the area. So it all started in Amherstburg. And the invitation to other churches said, believing that the time has now come that we should form ourselves into an association because we cannot enjoy the privileges we wish with the white churches in Canada, centuries having rolled along since our fathers were organized as a church, and believing that many of our fathers have gone down to the grave, not enjoying their just privileges and rights in the Christian churches among the whites, we invite all the Christian churches from the same faith and order to unite with us in the great celestial union in strength. United we stand, divided we fall. Come up, brethren, from all parts of the province, and let us see what we can do for ourselves and our children. And this quote is from Madison J. Lightfoot. He was the church clerk at the time, and he became a pastor as well. And the result of this invitation was the Alliance of the Baptist Association for Colored People, which was later named the Amherstburg Regular Baptist Association, and then the Amherstburg Regular Missionary Baptist Association, which I'm sure is a name that more of you are familiar with. Now, the church also had Underground Railroad history and anti-slavery activism within its walls. As mentioned, the Reverend Anthony Binga Sr. was a conductor in the Underground Railroad, and the Amherstburg First Baptist Church acted as a terminus that welcomed freedom seekers. They cared for freedom seekers until they were self-sufficient, provided food, shelter, and clothing, and helped them find employment and took care of them while they were sick. And while in Amherstburg, Reverend Binga wrote some observations saying, at Amherstburg, I kept a station. When we went there first, it was also almost a miracle to see 15 coming there at one time, and a wonder when one came. A long time after, they would come 30 in a day, and after the fugitive slave law took effect, by 50s every day like frogs in Egypt. In addition to being a terminus of the Underground Railroad, ARBA and the Amherstburg First Baptist Church contributed to the cause in other ways. In the early meetings, Amherstburg Baptist Association passed a resolution that said that the association would not recognize baptisms performed by slaveholding ministers, nor would they partake of the Lord's Supper with the association, believing that he who will sell his brother or sister for gold or silver today is not fit to administer the Lord's Supper or to baptize tomorrow. From its earliest existence, the organization set aside the last Monday in every month for a special concert of prayer for the downfall of slavery. African Canadians from the Baptist Church also served during the Civil War to free their brethren from in bonds. It was said that they would aid the Union until the old flag floats over every state from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Before 1866, ARBA was called the Amherstburg Anti-Slavery Regular Baptist Association, which expressed its solidarity toward their enslaved brothers and sisters. And following the Civil War, after slavery was abolished, the name was changed to the Amherstburg Regular Baptist Association. So outside of anti-slavery work and Underground Railroad history, the church also had other organizational work that it performed. Following the settlement of freedom seekers, organizational work occurred in Amherstburg. Literary clubs, youth groups, missionary and charitable societies that branched from the church assisted freedom seekers in adjusting to their new lives in freedom. But it also educated and trained them to be activists who could demand their rights. These social organizations contributed to the progress and development of the Black community in Amherstburg and laid the foundation for future activism. They taught members to support each other while educating them not only learning how to read, write, and debate, but also to present themselves as respectable citizens worthy of respect. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, negative stereotypes came with freedom seekers at no fault of the freedom seekers once they entered Canada, and these negative stereotypes were forced back upon that community. The negative actions of one, unfortunately, could represent all, which meant Black residents had to present themselves in the best version of themselves at all time or they'd face judgment. Organizations and church work were necessary to challenge these negative stereotypes. So some of the organizations that were created out of the Baptist Church included the Church Aid Society. It was created in 1850 out of the Baptist Church, and it was a mixed gender society. The Church Aid Society became the Amherstburg Guild in 1899, and then the Women's Guild in 1909. And it was established for the social benefit of the church and congregation. The Women's Guild at one point raised over $4,000, which was spent on decorations, 2 pianos, and an organ. Also, they also assisted with finances. At one point, it was written that the Women's Guild and Missionary are the only ones now in existence. The church has no debts on it. The doors are still open. Another organization was the Cheerful Workers, and it was established circa 1883, and it was around until at least 1893 based on the records. It was a mixed gender literary and philanthropic organization, and they hosted numerous fundraisers such as concerts, socials, dinners, and teas, where they would provide vocal and instrumental music. And some of the examples include a lawn social, oyster social, egg social, leap year social, and a pink social in the 1880s. And at this one, they served a lover's truth cake and a guest cake. Fundraisers helped to pay for the church's mortgage. One example is from 1887 when there was a children's concert that was done to raise funds. An additional example, there was a lawn social hosted by the Cheerful Workers, and it included a program with vocal and instrumental music, recitations, essays, and addresses from John H. Alexander and Delos R. Davis, who Mary-Katherine mentioned previously. There was youth involvement as well. One group in particular was the Busy Gleaners. It was a youth literary society that was formed out of the Baptist Church. It was established in 1887 to promote friendly intercourse and shall consist of recitations of essays and select readings of dialogues to raise means to aid the Baptist cause. And if you look here, this is the Constitution and minutes of the Busy Gleaners. It's from the Alvin D. McCurdy Fund at the Archives of Ontario. And this group was created to expand the charitable efforts of their parent organization, the Cheerful Workers, that I just mentioned, through fundraisers. One quote described their efforts. It said, "The pews, wainscoting, and windows and door frames are in oak, and the ceiling is sky blue. We understand the Busy Gleaners intend to have the walls papered." Fundraisers in this group included concerts, teas, socials, and dinners. And two examples are a rainbow social and a winter concert and fair. Now, at the rainbow social, they had the theme of colors of the rainbow, and each member chose a color to represent themselves. Members such as Miss Crawford, who was in charge of ice cream, chose white. Ella, who was in charge of lemonade, she chose to wear violet. And Lizzie, who was to bring peanuts, she chose green. So she brought peanuts with her. They accumulated $7 without even charging admission, and the winter concert and fair had an ice palace, fishing pond, and quilts on display. So it was quite an event. So youth involvement wasn't just through organizations. Sunday schools were also used as an educational tool. Sunday schools and Bible classes were formed in Arba as early as 1842, so that the rising generation, quote, "may be able to take the place of the old veterans when they are gone." Education was key, which included writing and reciting essays and poetry. And two really amazing examples, I'm going to talk about those. The first one is an exemplary 11-year-old girl named Little Winnie Francis, and she retells events from the Bible and warns the audience to avoid temptation in her essay, The Goodness and Greatness of God. And these essays were published in the minutes of Arba, so they would have been public to anyone who was a member and got the minutes. Another example is Little Willie Grayson. He spoke of the importance of religious devotion and Sabbath schools in his work, The Importance of Sunday Schools. And these essays, it was a way for students to prove how effective Sunday school lessons could be through their written work and public speaking, while leading their parents down a moral path with the messages that they shared, because these students would learn these messages and they would bring them home to their families and share those messages with them. So the organizational work in the post-Underground Railroad period continues with more efforts from Arba. The Arba Sabbath School also created the Baptist Union, Young People's Union, to keep the momentum going. This group was meant to fill in the gap between youth involvement in Sunday schools and the active participation of adult members in church work. They didn't want any opportunity for children to lose interest in Christian work, which is why they had made their involvement continuous. This next step was for former pupils of these Sabbath schools to apply what they learned. As a result, the Arba Sabbath School appointed young people as missionaries who organized and assisted in Sabbath school works. In the 1875 Arba Minutes, Sandwich Sabbath School teacher Julia Turner, formerly of Amherstburg, reported that she believed the children to be making rapid progress in Canada as elsewhere, according to their circumstances, that missionaries had gone from Canada to the south. Missionaries who were educated in Canada are now preaching. Now I'm going to talk about the participation of women, mainly through the Women's Home Missionary Society, which was established and first met in 1883, and it was meant to promote the gospel, assist churches in need, and contributed funds to the Baptist Missionary Convention of Ontario. And I'm going to highlight two very important women. The first one is Elizabeth Shadd Shreve. She's on the left, and she was the president. Shreve was known to travel on horseback, ministering to the sick, helping the needy, and preaching the gospel to residents, regardless of their denomination, in areas such as Buxton and Shrewsbury. Mary Branton, who's pictured on the right, she was of Amherstburg, and she also acted as the president. According to the Amherstburg Echo in April 1893, Miss Branton paid a visit to North Buxton's Baptist residence where she took the stand and gave a very able discourse from the 37th chapter of Ezekiel to a very attentive congregation. At the close, she sang a beautiful missionary hymn of her own composing. She is a very young lady of much enthusiasm and ability. She is visiting all the Baptist churches in the province in the interests of the society. And between 1896 and 1911, Branton performed missionary work in South Africa over a distance of 2,000 miles, with much of her travel being on foot. In 1914, realizing the need for foreign missions, the name was changed to the Women's Home and Foreign Mission Society. And moving forward several decades, this is an article from 1942, and in it, ARBA passes a resolution that discrimination towards persons of color be brought to the attention of the public. And it mentions that places in southwestern Ontario refused the following things. They've refused to serve and food and drink to men of color, even while wearing a uniform, because you have to remember at this point there were veterans of World War I and also actively serving soldiers of World War II at this time. And they also refused to employ Black workers in certain wartime industries as well as in peacetime production, and also to enlist Black volunteers in certain branches of military service, no matter how high their qualifications. And this article was printed in the Windsor Star. And the article also quotes Armba saying, "It is an insult to the people of Canada to suggest that they are too ignorant or prejudiced to work or fight side by side for the preservation of all that we hold dear." And moving forward even further into the present, this is a photograph from October 14, 2017, and it's Parks Canada and the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada designating the Amherstburg First Baptist Church as a place of national historic significance. So now I'm going to move it back over to Mary-Katherine, who's going to talk about Mount Beulah Church of God in Christ.
So while the limestone building located at 250 King Street in Amherstburg has been a church known as Mount Beulah Church of God in Christ for over 70 years, it was originally built in 1875 as the King Street School. In 1850, the Common Schools Act, the legislation governing education in Ontario, was amended. A separate schools clause was added. This clause allowed for the establishment of separate schools for Catholics, Protestants, and Black persons. Black children were prohibited from attending the common school, forcing the Black community to create their own separate school. By 1851, a separate school for Black children had been opened in a small log building on King Street under the Common Schools Act. Although the Black community originally wanted their own school, no real effort was made on the part of the school board to integrate the children into the common school. In Amherstburg, the children applied for admission to the common school. At a meeting held by the public school trustees on April 1st of 1851, it was decided to call a meeting with the teachers for the purpose of hearing their opinion on the matter. At the meeting held on April 2nd of 1851, teachers were advised to send all, in quotes, colored children requesting admission to the schools to the trustees so they could be decided on a case-to-case basis. Trustees would decide against these cases. When Mrs. Levi Foster requested the board to admit her children to the public school in 1871, the family received this refusal. In quotes, "At a meeting of the Common School Trustees, your wife's application for the admission of your children into the white department of the Common School, as she chose to term it, was read and considered. The trustees are of the opinion that it is inexpedient to alter the present arrangement of the different departments, inasmuch as the colored department is sufficient for the wants and needs of the colored people." End quote. In 1864, the King Street School was relocated from the rented log building into a frame building on the west side of King between Gore and Murray Streets. In 1875, a new limestone building structure was built to accommodate the 60 students there. By the late 19th century, the schoolhouse also served as a recreation center and a meeting place for Sunday school classes and literary society meetings for the Amherstburg's Black residents. The building was also used for debates, dances, boxing matches, and concerts. So this image here is of some of the students from the King Street School and their teacher standing behind them, John H. Alexander. So I'm just going to be talking about organizational work within that building, as it wasn't a church quite yet. But the Cheerful Workers, as Lorene had mentioned, as a charitable and educational organization from the Amherstburg First Baptist Church, they held numerous events at the building where the King Street School was located. And these are just some examples from the Amherstburg Echo of events that they held as fundraising events for the Amherstburg First Baptist Church. There was also the Amherstburg Literary Association, which I mentioned previously, and these are some, clippings from the Amherstburg Echo, just illustrating that they were an active organization, and it was, to share discourse about, literature at the time, and they did also have prominent members from the community. For example, we have Augustus Adams, and he was the assistant secretary, and in the photo in the slide, he's on the right-hand side, on the far right-hand side. The King Street School served the community until 1912, when the Amherstburg schools were finally integrated. The King Street School students were transferred to the public school on Richmond Street. So this is a picture here again of the King Street School from 1892 from the Toronto Daily Mail, and again from January 9th, 1892, and this is courtesy of the Marsh Collection in Amherstburg. So I'm just going to talk briefly about John H. Alexander. Beginning in about 1880 at the age of 21 and for over 30 years, John H. Alexander ran the King Street School. Born in Anderton to Thomas Alexander, who was formerly enslaved in Kentucky, and Catherine Harding. He received his early education locally at Windsor High School and then graduated from London Normal School with a teaching certificate. Upon receiving his teacher's certificate, John Henry taught first at Puce and then moved on to North Buxton in 1878. The following year, he taught in Dresden before returning to the Amherstburg area. And again, after teaching after 30 years, he retired in 1917 while teaching at the Marble Village School in Anderton. He later served on Amherstburg Town Council from 1923 to 1926 and was appointed town assessor in 1930, a position that he retained until illness forced his retirement. He was also the town auditor and superintendent of the AME Sunday School for over 20 years. He died in 1935. Now, I mentioned Marble Village in the previous slide where John H. Alexander taught. Marble Village was a settlement established by a white Anderton resident, Rowland Wingfield, who was opposed to slavery and was an abolitionist. The settlement was inhabited by freedom seekers who were encouraged to settle there. And many worked as farmers, but a significant number also worked at the local stone quarries or the local sawmill. Within the settlement, there was a small rural school called the Quarry School or Marble Village School, which included teachers such as John Alexander and Julia Turner. Later, a school attended solely by whites was erected on Texas Road, east of the third concession. The white families attending this school petitioned to have it made the official common school for the school section, which would have deprived the Marble Village School of the government stipend. So, a court case ensued, and the Marble Village School was victorious and was able to continue operation as public school section number 1. When the school on Texas Road burned, its pupils transferred to either the Marble Village School or a separate school section number 3 and 4, which was known as the Spring Hill School. When King Street School was closed around 1912, its former principal, John Alexander, continued to teach at the Marble Village School until his retirement in 1917. The Marble Village School closed in 1917 after 60 years, and its students were transferred to the new public school section number 1. So this image here is courtesy of the Archives of Ontario from the Alvin McCurdy Fawn, and these are children in front of the Marble Village School, and it's the only image that we have of the school. Now, fast forward, moving on to more modern history, the building was used briefly as a barracks during the First World War, housing recruits who enlisted for service overseas. In 1918, it was purchased by Amherstburg hardware merchant George Pettypiece, who operated a cement works there for several years. And in January of 1949, the building was purchased by Ernest and Viola Harris, who purchased the land and buildings on Lot 27 and granted the property to the Canadian Church of God in Christ. Under the leadership of its founder, Bishop C.L. Morton Sr., Elder Ernest E. Harris became the first pastor. So this is an image here of Bishop C.L. Morton Sr. For many years previous to 1949, services had been held on Park Street in what is today the Morley Stewart home for a period. The church was remodeled and renamed Mount Beulah Church of God in Christ in 1949. An addition to the rear of the structure was erected in September of 1984, allowing for Sunday school rooms, washrooms, a kitchen, dining area, and pastor study. The sanctuary was remodeled in October of 1992, and the list of pastors at Mount Beulah Church of God in Christ, as recalled by Pastor Maynard Hurst, include Ernest E. Harris, Morley Stewart, Norval Wilson, Lyle Jones, Lionel Riley, and the current pastor, Maynard Hurst. So I'm going to pass it back to Lorene, who's going to speak about Central Grove.
Great. So I'm going to talk about Central Grove African Methodist Episcopal Church. This is the last church that we'll be talking about today. So just some background information. It's located at 4005 Walker Road in Harrow, which is part of Colchester. And before a church building was constructed, church services were held in the woods on the property until a small frame building was built in 1888. A committee consisting of James Johnson, Henry Graham, James W. Dennis, Squire Hamilton, and Peter Jackson approached Theodore Larrabee and convinced him to sell 4 acres of wooded land on Lot 9 on the corner of the 3rd Concession and Walker Road to use for the church. The church property was purchased for $200 with the stipulation that a church be built on the property and that it not be sold and it remain as the Central Grove church property. It was named Central Grove because it was centrally located between other AME church locations in Amherstburg, New Canaan, and Pleasant Valley. It was also located in a grove of, quote, exceptionally fine timber. Increasing membership caused the building of a new Central Grove AME church in the same location in 1909-1910, and the cost of the new building was $3,000. And as you'll see here in the article below the picture of the church, the cornerstone was laid in May 1911 by Reverend A.W. Hackley of Amherstburg. And some more history. Following an explosion in 1907 at Grace Methodist Church, some of the items, so including bricks, an altar, and other remnants of the church, the damaged church, were used in the new Central Grove construction. So they took items from that destroyed church or that damaged church and used it to build their own. A quote from Milo Johnson's book, New Canaan Freedom Land, says, "The members and friends hauled loads of bricks and other materials by horse and buggy wagons. These same types of conveyances were used to haul sand and gravel from the lake at Colchester. The gravel and sand were used to make mortar for the foundation. Members and friends toiled tirelessly on the construction of their church." In 1921, the church's mortgage, which went back to the 1880s, it was paid, so members held a gathering to celebrate. At the event, the congregation packed the church and they listened to addresses, with the opening hymn being "The old account was settled long ago." According to one account, fervor reached a high pitch during the pastor's oration, where 3 trustees, Albert Mulder, William Kersey, and Charles Hyder, holding a large plate containing the mortgage, at a signal touched a match to the paper and watched it consume, while the congregation sang with thankful hearts, "Praise God from whom all blessings flow." So this church, like the other churches we talked about, had organizational work as well. One organization was the Central Grove Lyceum, so it was an educational group. According to the Evening Record, Central Grove Lyceum was established in October 1896. I couldn't find any earlier references to it, and they would meet every Tuesday, which changed to Wednesdays in 1899. An earlier debate of the Central Grove Lyceum included 4 gentlemen members asking the question, what keeps the Black man back the most, his color or his condition? Other topics included which wields the most influence, the orator or the writer? And another debate, that war is a greater educator than education in regard to civilization. Women also participated in these debates. In 1896, Miss Martha Miller, Miss Ada Kersey, Miss R.M. Dennis, and Miss Alira Dixon, who were possibly members, but it's not stated specifically, they did a debate, which is more attractive to the eye, art or nature. This group also hosted social and literary entertainment to financially support the church. For example, in 1898, they had an event to raise funds to pay the pastor's salary. They also hosted mock trials, at least between 1902 and 1903. A mock trial was held in February 1903, for example, which was described as a mock breach of promise trial, with N.S. Powell, who was the defense, and Reverend W.H. Boson as the prosecutor. Now, I'd mentioned women's participation in debates, but it went beyond that, particularly through the Women's Might Missionary Society of Central Grove AME Church. It was a fundraising group for the church and the community, and it was named the Hattie Johnson Missionary Society after Hattie Holland Johnson. It was later named this after Hattie Holland Johnson, who was their president for 19 years, from 1922 to 1941, and she's pictured here. Hattie Holland Johnson was president of the Women's Might Missionary Society, also the superintendent of the Sunday school, and was corresponding secretary of the Ontario Conference of AME Churches. In an interview, Hattie Holland Johnson shared some activities of the group and said, as Tabitha in the New Testament and others sewed for the poor and patched Jesus's shabby clothes, so we in this time want to make contributions to the poor. So we devised a plan to make a quilt and charge 10 cents to anyone wishing their name sewn on it. We also have dinners, sell oyster suet, pies and cakes, and other methods of making money to send to foreign missions in the AME conference. So for anyone who's interested in knowing what the quilt looked like, we are actually very lucky to have this quilt within our collection, the one that people charge 10 cents to have their names on. So if you look closely at the image on the right, here's just an example of the quilt, and you can see names such as Elvira Graham, Harry Hurst, Elzora Banks, Harlan Johnson, Virginia Sawyer, and many more. It's actually a very beautiful quilt to see in person. So the church was also involved in the war effort, especially during World War I. An article titled Colchester South Clubs Give Socks, which was from the Evening Record from November 3rd, 1914. It reported, quote, the entertainment on Thursday evening given by the Central Gulf Club to raise funds for patriotic purposes was well patronized, notwithstanding the evening was rainy and disagreeable. The proceeds netted $30, and on Saturday, James P. Johnson, president of the club, with Mr. A.B. Herring, motored to Amherstburg and bought and shipped 15 dozen pairs of woolen socks from the Hamilton Lewitt Knitting Company, Amherstburg, to Colonel E.S. Weigel, Wolseley Barracks, London, for distribution among the soldiers from Essex County under the colonel's command. Mr. Johnson wishes to thank those who contributed towards the success of the entertainment, and you'll see the article on the right here. Another example, on September 21st, 1916, also from the Evening Record, shared an additional example stating there would be a meeting held at Central Grove on the evening of September 23rd to persuade the boys that in that district to enlist in the No. 2 Construction Battalion. Quote, recruiting is active hereabouts. Last Saturday, 12 men left for Toronto. Reverend Levi Wells, pastor of the First Baptist Church, gave the boys a fitting send-off. Reverend Mr. Edwards addressed the first lot that went away. And here's a picture of the No. 2 Construction Battalion on the bottom. And for those who aren't aware, it was Canada's first and only all-Black battalion, and over 100 Black men from Essex County enlisted. The church also had Decoration Day, and this involved members gathering to clean up the church's cemetery and pay respects to their elders and to their ancestors. Among them was William Kersey Sr. He's pictured here on the left, and he was a skilled carpenter, and he was a devoted member and trustee of Central Grove. He was a manager of Decoration Day cleanup bees, which involved members of the congregation cleaning up the Central Grove Cemetery. Participants were asked to bring spades, shovels, ferns, and flower seeds to beautify the property. Following the cleanup bee, participants enjoyed a social, which included a concert. So Decoration Days could also be a political event. It wasn't just about beautifying the cemetery, such as building fences, for example, but it did have a political purpose. At one Decoration Day, Dr. Sweet of Detroit, he attended a gathering and gave a speech that, quote, urged the improvement of the status of his race, and the keynote of it was self-respect. One must have self-respect before others will show respect. And one of the surest ways to obtain self-respect and show that one had it was to clean up, brush up, and brace up. The work of the church must not be neglected. The church and its work was the prime need of his race, and had been the means of the colored people working their way from the darkness of slavery into the privileges of freedom. Dr. Sweet also urged listeners to take an interest in things political and to not neglect the privileges of the ballot, which he said was the last weapon of the colored man. Quote, end quote. So the church was also a gathering space for politics as well, inside the church. The Border City Stars, for example, reported on September 26, that the Central Grove was the site of a political gathering where candidates spoke to the community. Eccles J. Gott, for example, he was a conservative candidate for Essex South, and he spoke to the audience for over an hour and a half about local issues and outlined the attitude of the Conservative Party. Two members of the community, Forrest Matthews and Bud Johnson, also had an opportunity to speak at this meeting. In 1949, John Diefenbaker, who's pictured on the right, he became the future prime minister, or became the prime minister, and he made an appearance at Central Grove, which was described in the Windsor Daily Star. And they said at 11:30 last night, Mr. Diefenbaker and Mr. Jasperson visited the Central Grove AME Church, 4th Concession, Colchester South, where nearly 50 people were gathered. Mr. Diefenbaker was moved with the idea of a political assembly in a church and spoke briefly on the Bill of Rights, which he attempted to father through the House. He spoke of the close association between political and religious beliefs and said that PCs are pledged to equality for all. So Diefenbaker, he argued that Canada needed a Bill of Rights to keep people from becoming second-class citizens due to the color of their skin, their creed, or their racial origin, and he enacted the Canadian Bill of Rights in 1960, years after his visit to Central Grove, and this was after he became Prime Minister in 1957. So that's everything we have to share with you today. And we do recognize that this is not the only history of these churches. There's more information that can be shared, and there are other churches that are very significant that you can learn more about. And we hope that this is a starting point for you to learn more about this topic. And you can visit our website and also our social media pages to learn more about this significant topic. So thank you for joining us, and we'll just see if there's any questions. Okay, so if anyone has any questions, you're welcome to raise your hand or put it into the comments section, or you can reach out to us after our presentation as well, or stop by for a visit. You're welcome anytime. Okay, so I think we'll end it there. Thank you all for joining us today. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. And we again hope that this is a starting point for you to learn more about the significant churches in this area and other really important churches as well. Following this presentation, I'm going to post some resources that we've put together for you to learn more as well. So the learning can continue. So thank you so much and have a great day.